For 37 years, she didn't have a name. Investigators knew she had lived, they knew she had dreams, a family somewhere, and people who might still be wondering what happened to her, but none of them knew who she was. To the world, she became nothing more than a label, a Jane Doe. Her photograph appeared in police files. Her case was passed from one detective to another. New technology came and went.
Thousands of missing person reports were compared. Every lead ended the same way. Nowhere. As the years passed, hope slowly faded. It seemed impossible that anyone would ever learn her identity. Then, decades later, a single breakthrough changed everything. Not a witness, not a confession, not a forgotten piece of evidence, but DNA. A new investigative technique accomplished what decades of traditional detective work could not. It gave a name back to a woman who had been forgotten for nearly 4 decades, and it revealed the identity of the man responsible, even though he had been dead for years. This wasn't just another cold case. It became one of the most important investigations in modern forensic history, because for the first time, DNA didn't just identify a victim, it identified both the victim and the killer. This is the extraordinary story of Mary Silvani, the woman the world once knew only as Jane Doe. But before science finally uncovered the truth, we have to go back to the summer of 1982. In the summer of 1982, Mary Edith Silvani was 33 years old. She had spent most of her life in Michigan, where friends and family remembered her as kind, independent, and determined to build a life on her own terms. Like many people in their 30s, Mary was searching for a fresh start. She had traveled west, eventually arriving in Reno, Nevada, a city known for its casinos, busy nightlife, and the promise of new opportunities. For some, Reno was a place to reinvent themselves. For others, it was simply a stop along the way. Mary hoped it would become the beginning of a better chapter. She wasn't famous. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't someone who expected to make headlines. She was simply another woman trying to build a future, surrounded by thousands of strangers passing through the city every day. In July of 1982, Mary was staying in the Reno area, going about her daily life, much like anyone else. Nothing about those summer days suggested they would become the last moments anyone could confidently trace. Then, she disappeared. There were no frantic phone calls, no immediate nationwide search, no dramatic breaking news. At least, not at first, because no one realized that Mary had vanished without a trace. And that heartbreaking reality would become one of the biggest obstacles investigators would face for decades. Before we continue, if you enjoy true crime documentaries that focus on real investigations, forgotten cold cases, and the breakthroughs that finally uncover the truth, please consider supporting the channel. A quick like helps more people discover these stories, subscribing means you won't miss future documentaries, and sharing this video truly helps the channel grow. Thank you for being here. Now, back to the story. Just days later, in a remote area outside Reno, someone would make a discovery that would leave investigators searching for answers for the next 37 years. On July 17, 1982, a man traveling through a remote area known as Sheep's Flat, just outside Reno, Nevada, came across something unexpected. The location was quiet, isolated, and far from the busy casinos and crowded streets that most people associated with the city. It wasn't a place where many people stopped. What he discovered prompted an immediate call to law enforcement. Within hours, investigators arrived and secured the scene. They quickly realized they were dealing with a homicide. The victim was an adult woman, but almost immediately, detectives ran into a major problem. There was nothing at the scene that clearly identified who she was. No driver's license, no purse, no document that could tell investigators her name. Every piece of physical evidence was carefully collected. Crime scene investigators documented the area, photographed everything they could, and preserved biological evidence using the best forensic methods available at the time. The hope was simple. If they couldn't identify the victim today, perhaps the evidence would help someday. Detectives began working backward. Who was she? Where had she come from? Who had seen her last? Those questions should have been the starting point of every homicide investigation. Instead, They became the investigation itself. The woman had no identity. No one had reported finding someone matching her description. No family members came forward looking for her. No missing person report immediately matched the evidence investigators had. As the days turned into weeks, the unidentified victim was given a name that wasn't really a name at all. She became known as Sheep's Flat Jane Doe. It was a temporary label one detectives hoped would only last a few days. No one imagined it would remain attached to her for nearly 4 decades. With no obvious suspect and no confirmed identity, investigators had only one option. They would have to search for a woman whose name they didn't even know, and that would prove to be far more difficult than anyone expected. In the weeks that followed, investigators worked every lead they could find. The first priority was simple: give Jane Doe her name. Detectives carefully documented her physical characteristics, estimated her age, and compared her fingerprints against state and national databases. Nothing matched. They examined dental records, hoping a dentist somewhere would recognize the information. Again, nothing. Missing person reports from Nevada were reviewed one by one. When those produced no answers, the search expanded to neighboring states. Then farther across the country, every possibility was considered. Could she have been traveling? Had she recently moved to Reno? Did someone report her missing under a different name? The questions kept growing. The answers never came. Investigators released facial reconstructions and descriptions to the public, hoping someone would recognize her. Newspaper articles appeared. Television stations covered the case. Tips came in from time to time. Each one offered a brief spark of hope. Each one eventually led nowhere. As the months became years, detectives were forced to face an uncomfortable reality. Without knowing who the victim was, identifying the person responsible became dramatically more difficult. Every homicide investigation begins with the victim's story: who they knew, where they worked, who they trusted, where they spent their last hours. But in this case, there was no story to follow, only questions. The investigation changed hands as detectives retired and new investigators took over. Boxes of evidence were carefully preserved. Case files continued to grow. Yet every new detective inherited the same mystery. Who was the woman buried under the name Sheep's Flat Jane Doe? By the 1990s, the trail had grown cold. By the 2000s, many feared it would never be solved. 30 years passed, then 35. Technology improved. Forensic science advanced. Cold cases across America began to reopen, but this one remained frozen in time. It seemed as though the woman without a name might remain unidentified forever. What investigators didn't know was that a revolutionary breakthrough was quietly transforming criminal investigations across the country. And before long, it would give this forgotten Jane Doe something no detective had been able to provide for nearly 37 years: her identity. For decades, cases like this were among the most frustrating investigations in law enforcement. Not because detectives didn't care, and not because they stopped trying. The problem was much simpler. They had no name to begin with. Before the age of modern DNA technology, identifying an unknown victim depended heavily on traditional methods: fingerprints, dental records, personal belongings, or someone reporting a loved one missing. If none of those pieces fit together, the investigation could reach a dead end surprisingly quickly. That happened far more often than most people realize. Across the United States, hundreds of unidentified men, women, and children remained in evidence rooms for years, sometimes decades. Each had a story, each had a family somewhere, but investigators had no way to connect one to the other. The passage of time only made things worse. Families moved. Witnesses forgot important details. Paper records disappeared. Potential evidence slowly faded with each passing year. Many detectives believed that if a case wasn't solved within the first few years, it might never be solved at all. Mary's case became one of those heartbreaking mysteries. A woman whose life had been erased from the public record, known only by a location where she was found. Nothing more. For nearly 4 decades, that seemed destined to be her legacy. But while Mary's case remained untouched, science was quietly catching up. In the late 2010s, investigators began using a completely different approach. Instead of asking, Whose fingerprints are these? They started asking, who could this person be related to? That single change in thinking would revolutionize criminal investigations. And it was about to do something many believed was impossible. It was going to give Jane Doe her name back. By 2018, Mary's case had remained unsolved for nearly 37 years. The evidence had been carefully preserved. Detectives had never stopped hoping. What they had been waiting for was the right technology. That opportunity came through a growing field known as forensic genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional DNA testing, which compares a DNA sample to someone already in a criminal database, forensic genetic genealogy works differently. Imagine building a giant family tree. Instead of looking for one exact match, investigators search for distant relatives, people who may share only a small percentage of DNA with the unknown person. Those relatives often have no idea they're connected to a criminal investigation. They simply uploaded their DNA to public genealogy databases to learn more about their family history. For investigators, even a distant cousin can become the first piece of an enormous puzzle. Once several relatives are identified, genealogists begin tracing family trees. They work backward, then forward, connecting marriages, births, siblings, and generations until one person fits the evidence. It isn't quick. It isn't easy. Sometimes it takes months of painstaking research. Other times, it takes years. In Mary's case, investigators partnered with the DNA Doe Project, a nonprofit organization that specializes in identifying unknown victims using forensic genealogy. The organization brought together volunteer genetic genealogists from across the country. Their mission wasn't to solve the homicide. Not yet. Their first goal was much simpler: find out who Jane Doe really was. Using DNA recovered decades earlier, a genetic profile was created and uploaded to a genealogy database where users had chosen to make their information available for law enforcement investigations. Soon, possible relatives began to appear. Not parents, not siblings, not even close cousins. Most were distant family members who had never heard of the unidentified woman investigators were trying to identify. To an ordinary person, those matches wouldn't seem very useful. But to experienced genealogists, they were exactly what they needed. One branch of a family tree became 2. 2 became 10. 10 became hundreds of individuals spread across multiple generations. Every birth certificate, every marriage record, every census document, every obituary, every public record helped eliminate one possibility and point toward another. Hours turned into weeks. Weeks became months. Researchers built family trees stretching back generations, carefully following every branch that might eventually lead to the unidentified woman from Sheep's Flat. Then, one branch stood out. Several DNA matches appeared to converge on the same Michigan family. Investigators narrowed their search even further. Among the names connected to that family was a woman who had quietly disappeared from public view decades earlier. Her name was Mary Silvani. It was an extraordinary discovery, but genealogy alone wasn't enough. Family trees can suggest an identity. They cannot prove one. Detectives still needed one final piece of evidence: a direct DNA comparison. Only then could they say, with certainty, that the woman known for nearly 4 decades as Sheep's Flat, Jane Doe, had finally been found. And when the laboratory results came back, they changed everything. The final step was both simple and incredibly important. Investigators located members of Mary's biological family and requested a DNA comparison. If the genetic profile matched, the mystery that had lasted nearly 4 decades would finally come to an end. The laboratory analysis confirmed it. The unidentified woman found near Sheep's Flat in July 1982 was Mary Silvani. After 37 years, Jane Doe finally had her name back. For investigators, it was a remarkable moment. Many of the detectives who had originally worked the case had long since retired. Some were no longer alive to witness the breakthrough. Yet the evidence they had carefully preserved all those years earlier had made this moment possible. Just as important was the work of the forensic scientists and volunteer genealogists who refused to give up on someone they had never met. Together, they had accomplished what once seemed impossible. For Mary's family, the confirmation brought a mixture of emotions. The uncertainty that had lasted for decades was finally over. The question of who the unidentified woman was had been answered. At last, Mary could be remembered by her real name instead of a case number. For most investigations, this would have been the ending. The victim had been identified. The mystery had been solved. Or so it seemed, because detectives were now able to ask a question they had never been able to ask before. Who knew Mary? Who was she with during her final days? Who had crossed paths with her in the summer of 1982? For the first time in nearly 4 decades, investigators finally had a real victim to investigate. And that changed everything. Using the same revolutionary DNA technology that restored Mary's identity, detectives turned their attention to the biological evidence collected from the crime scene decades earlier. If it could identify Mary, could it also identify the person responsible? The answer was yes. And what investigators discovered next was even more astonishing than finding Mary's name. With Mary's identity finally confirmed, investigators turned back to the evidence collected in 1982. For decades, one particular DNA sample had been preserved. When the case was first investigated, the technology simply didn't exist to learn very much from it. Now, everything was different. Detectives decided to apply the same strategy that had identified Mary. This time, however, they weren't looking for a victim. They were looking for a suspect. A genetic profile was developed from the evidence and uploaded under strict legal guidelines to a public genealogy database, where users had chosen to make their DNA available for investigative comparisons. Again, the search did not produce an immediate answer. There was no perfect match, no flashing notification with the suspect's name. Instead, investigators found several distant relatives. Just as before, forensic genealogists began building family trees. They traced generations of births, marriages, siblings, and descendants, carefully narrowing the possibilities. Every branch they eliminated brought them one step closer to the truth. Weeks of research slowly became a single family. That family eventually led investigators to one man, James Richard Curry. At first, detectives were cautious. Genealogy can point investigators in the right direction, but it cannot stand alone. Every conclusion had to be supported by additional evidence. They began reviewing Curry's background. What they found immediately caught their attention. In the early 1980s, Curry had lived in Nevada. More importantly, he was known to have been in the Reno area around the same time Mary disappeared. The timeline fit, the location fit, but investigators needed much more than coincidence. They continued comparing historical records, reviewing old investigative files, and examining everything they could learn about Curry's movements during that period. Then another discovery changed the direction of the case. James Richard Curry was no longer alive. He had died in 1983 while in prison, just 1 year after Mary's death. That meant detectives would never have the opportunity to question him. There would be no interview, no courtroom, no trial. But the investigation did not stop there. Investigators worked to confirm that the DNA evidence and the genealogical research pointed to the same individual. As each piece of evidence was reviewed, the conclusion became increasingly clear. After nearly 4 decades, the unidentified DNA profile from the crime scene finally had a name. It belonged to James Richard Curry. For Mary's family, it meant long-awaited answers. For investigators, it meant closing one of Nevada's oldest unsolved homicide cases. But the significance of this investigation reached far beyond a single case. Because this wasn't just another cold case solved by DNA. It marked a turning point in modern criminal investigations, one that would inspire hundreds of other agencies to reopen cases that had once seemed impossible to solve. The murder of Mary Silvani didn't just close a decades-old investigation. It quietly reshaped the future of criminal forensics. For most of modern history, unidentified victims were among the hardest cases to solve. Once fingerprints failed, once dental records led nowhere, and once time erased the memory of a person's life, the case often stayed unsolved forever. Mary's case proved that was no longer true. For the first time, investigators successfully used forensic genetic genealogy to achieve something that traditional methods never could. They didn't just identify a suspect. They restored a victim's identity after nearly 4 decades. And they did it using distant relatives who had no idea they were connected to a homicide investigation. After this case, law enforcement agencies across the United States began re-examining hundreds of cold cases. Many of them involved unidentified victims who had been forgotten for years. Some had been waiting even longer than Mary. What once seemed like impossible mysteries were suddenly being reopened with new hope. But beyond the science and the investigation, there was something even more important. A human life had been returned to its name. Mary was no longer a file in a cabinet. She was no longer a question mark in a database. She was someone's daughter again, someone's memory again. And after 37 years of silence, her story was finally told. For nearly 4 decades, she was known only as Sheep's Flat Jane Doe, a label created out of necessity, but never meant to define who she was. She had lived a life before that moment. She had a family. She had a name. And because of advances in science, that name was not lost forever. It was only waiting to be found. Mary Edith Silvani, a woman who disappeared into a mystery in 1982 and returned to history in 2019, not as a case number, but as a person. And somewhere behind every cold case still waiting to be solved, there may be another name, just waiting for the right breakthrough to bring it back.